Every parent wants their child to grow, to explore, and to dream big. At MPB, we're proud to support families and teachers across Mississippi with trusted educational programming and resources that inspire learning and spark imagination. From PBS Kids favorites to digital tools and early learning support, MPB is here for young minds, engaged classrooms, and families who believe in the power of learning at every age. Empowering families, inspiring learners. MPB, your stories, our mission.
At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
Sit down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi's future. Do people trust the media? Are we living in a post-truth world? Do Democrats have a message, or is the political battle of our time a fight between factions within the Republican Party? 100 days into President Trump's second term, lots of activity from the White House. Tariffs, immigration, foreign policy, drug pricing, and much, much more. Here to help us make sense of it all is a veteran writer and commentator, author of 3 books on the Bush-era foreign policy, a former Fox News contributor, and editor of the Weekly Standard, now turned co-founder of the Dispatch, and NBC contributor Steve Hayes. Steve, welcome to the Sit Down.
Hey, Russ, great to be with you.
Great to have you, man. You have occupied a pretty unique role for a while now, right? You've been sort of in the center of national politics and political commentary. You've been a thought leader within the conservative movement. It seems to me that trust in the media is at an all-time low. I mean, shocker of the day, right?
Right, exactly.
Has that been earned by the media, or is that a byproduct of a pretty purposeful campaign to erode trust in the media such that it can't hold people accountable, or is it a little bit of both?
I mean, I think what you're saying is I'm really old, right? I mean, I've just been around for so long that I've seen all this stuff, and I'm old. That explains my gray hair.
Not old, seasoned.
Yeah, seasoned is, I'll take seasoned. Veteran also works for me. Look, I think it's both, actually. One of the things that I sometimes have a hard time convincing my colleagues in what I would call mainstream media or left-leaning media, legacy media, establishment media, whatever you want to call it, is that there's a reason conservatives have grown so skeptical of the news that they've gotten from the mainstream media outlets. And I've been at this for a long time. My first ever commentary on ideological media bias came in 1988. At the Wisconsin State Forensics Championship, where I gave a speech about media bias and gave examples about the media miscovering George H.W. Bush and calling him a wimp. Dan Rather mischaracterizing things that the first President Bush had said, the way that they characterized George Romney when he dropped out of the presidential race back in the 1960s. And you move forward. I mean, I think, one of the biggest examples was in 2004, when 60 Minutes used forged documents to make the case that George W. Bush had gotten a sweetheart deal to get out of out of military service. And even after those documents were shown to be forged, you had people defending the reporting process and defending it. Well, you know what? Those of us who consider ourselves conservatives, we were paying attention. And every time you saw one of those things, to say nothing of, descriptions of think tanks like the Heritage Foundation as far right, and descriptions of think tanks like the Brookings Institution without any description. They're seen as just think tanks. We paid attention. And so I think it's been a long time coming, and it created this atmosphere of environment of skepticism from those of us on the right. Having said that, now I think what you're seeing, and my concern about what's happening on the right, is you've seen so many people who were longtime media critics, like myself, sort of go beyond criticizing the reporting and, in effect, creating this alternative information environment, some of which is based on facts, data, logic, reason. But a lot of it is based on the feelings and knee-jerk opinionating and, throwing off angry remarks to get people to come to your website. And I think that's a huge problem. And I think it affects the right more than it affects the left these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, the conversation around the competency of former President Biden has been central to a lot of political debate, really since the debate itself between he and President Trump. But before that, for a lot of conservatives who were saying this guy has clearly slipped a little bit, right?
Yes.
There's clear evidence that his gait is off. He makes an awful lot more gas than even what he used to make. And there's this bizarre moment now where the media is sort of saying, aha, we have discovered and are admitting that all of this was true, almost as if they've revealed something. Jake Tapper's book, Alex Thompson's book. But I think for a lot of conservatives, they're going, we've been saying this for years. And it feels an awful lot, to use a new age parlance, like gaslighting.
Yeah. I mean, it's the perfect example, right? I mean, we were raising questions about Joe Biden's mental acuity back in the 2020 election. I mean, I think there were reasons to ask those questions as far back as 2020. I'm in the process actually of reviewing that book for the Dispatch, so I'm reading it right now. I can't get into the details of it because I signed a non-disclosure agreement, but I think, some of the evidence that they provide in this reporting about exactly how bad things were, some of it's been reported already. The speech writing team changing the way that they wrote public remarks for Joe Biden because he couldn't give the remarks that he had been able to give, in 2020. That was happening in 2022. They were making big changes to the way the White House, the way that they treated the president. But I think this is a perfect example, and it's good to spend a beat on it because I think both things are true. It's definitely the case that the mainstream media did not pursue this story as it should have. And it was obvious not only to conservatives. I mean, remember, there were majorities of Democrats who were saying that they didn't think Joe Biden could complete a second term. So it was obvious to everybody that he had lost a step. And for those of us who've had relatives who, have had dementia problems or things, we saw those signs. And the sort of one of the phrases that you become familiar with is good days and bad days. And that's what we saw from Joe Biden. Sometimes he seemed okay. Sometimes he seemed with it. He could answer a question. He could give a State of the Union address, which was what they really rallied around, the Democrats rallied around. But at other times, he was just lost, and he would sort of venture down these verbal cul-de-sacs and look up and not know where he was or why he was there. And I think that the big problem was that there were moments where the mainstream media reported on this. I had two New York Times reporters, Jonathan Martin and Alex Burns, on the Dispatch podcast in April of 2022. And we had a long conversation based in part on reporting that they did for a book that came out in 2022 about Joe Biden's mental acuity. So it's not like nobody was reporting on this or nobody was talking about this. There was some reporting, including reporting from mainstream journalists about this. I think the difference is that's the kind of story that when you see it day in and day out, if it had been a Republican, it becomes the story. Right. So it was a marginal story. Sometimes you'd get some reporting on it, but it never became the Washington press corps obsession that other things do. And I think that's sort of the fault. And then the last point I'll make on this, you also did have outlets and reporters who I think were doing cover for the Biden White House. There was an Associated Press story a week before the debate that ultimately did Joe Biden in, all about, how conservatives were manipulating video to make it look like Joe Biden was having trouble when he really wasn't having that much trouble. A similar New York Times story. That, I think, is a problem. I mean, they were, in effect, doing cover for the White House and obscuring the truth rather than revealing it.
So I want to touch on this idea that there's some evidence to suggest that the skepticism was warranted, but there's the ability to also exploit that skepticism as part of this sort of outrage industrial complex.
Yes.
What you described as driving clicks towards websites. You guys had an article in the Dispatch, I think last week, that really shone a light on this idea that we have moved away from sort of rigorous analysis, the written word, and towards more surface level audio visual content in the way that we consume information now. And obviously that comes with some real hangups and risk, not the least of which is that you can dupe somebody a lot easier if they don't know the details, if there's not context and nuance. There's this tendency to want to shake your fist at the sky and say, let's go back to the written word. It doesn't seem like that's where we're going. So how do we adapt to make sure that truth gets in front of people?
I mean, it's a great question, and I will resist the temptation to give an infomercial for the Dispatch. But this is why we exist. This is what we did when we launched the Dispatch 6 years ago. We said, look, we're conservatives, we're on the center right, but nothing matters more than facts. And what we're saying, whether it's our reporting, whether it's our commentary, has to be tethered to reality. And you can't just have knee-jerk outrage bait as the sort of sustenance that you're providing people. The Republic won't survive long if that's what we're doing. It's somebody who eats only Cheetos. That's not going to work for very long. I think that the short answer to go directly to the sort of the prescription here is people have to care about the information they're consuming. You have to test it. You can't be a passive information consumer. There are too many people. I mean, everything in the sort of current media, I'll say ecosystem, I hate using that word, but the current media environment incentivizes this kind of outrage bait. It's an attention economy. In order to be influential, in order to make money, you need to get attention. And the way to get attention when there are a billion voices is to be louder and more outrageous than the next person. And you see people who have had success doing that. Alex Jones with InfoWars has monetized to the moon because he's able to give people stuff that gets them fired up and they keep coming back. There's also a problem with what I would describe as affirmation journalism rather than information journalism. Places where you go and they're going to tell you what you already think is true so that you consume this information and just nod your head along. And look, I like to think that reality is conservative. I've operated under that assumption for a long time. But there are times when sometimes my priors don't actually accord with reality. Right now, for instance, to use one example, President Trump's tariffs, I believed from the beginning, and I think there's 300 years worth of economics that'll suggest eventually they're going to cause some inflation. There may not be a direct causal link, but I think it's coming. And we saw the inflation numbers. It was a mixed report, but a couple of days ago, go down. So I can't pretend that didn't happen because of what I believed beforehand. And we at the Dispatch wrote, hey, this was actually a mixed thing, and this is sort of surprising, but this is the reality. And I think we need to have news consumers who approach information in that way, if that makes sense.
It does. As you were talking about sort of affirmation journalism, I think a lot about the new media and some of the characters that are part of the new media. There's a guy on X named Cat Turd, which is a lovely name, who has millions of followers. And the way that he's built that is by adhering to whatever the current president says as being a good thing. And I'll give a real world example of this. So when RFK Jr. was running for president, Cat Turd literally said, if you follow RFK on this platform, I'm going to block you because RFK is evil vis-a-vis his position on abortion. And then 3 months later, as he gets nominated for HHS secretary, he comes out and says, if you don't vote for the confirmation of RFK Jr., who I just said was evil, you are evil and a traitor to the Republic. And so I look at that and I go, one, where's the integrity of being willing to take these diametrically opposite positions? But two, he is rewarded for it. So what does it tell you about the fact that some of these sort of permanent cheerleaders have developed this kind of popularity? I mean, is it a sign that what the public really wants is to be affirmed and not to be challenged?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's what you've just described. I mean, the cat turd example is the perfect example. And I think that's the concern. It may be the case that people just want to have their views affirmed rather than challenged, rather than have to confront reality, and sometimes unpleasant reality. There's another one of these, I would call them sort of right-wing provocateurs, right-wing influencers. I don't use the term conservative. I still call myself a conservative. I don't think they're conservative. The things they're arguing don't align with my view of conservatism. But this guy named Benny Johnson was twice credibly accused and proven to be a plagiarist, and let go from BuzzFeed, let go from National Review. And he has a podcast now. He's got 3 million followers on Twitter. And if a Republican elected official wants to have an argument that he's making, or a bill that he's proposing, or something amplified in that sort of center-right world, a lot of them choose to go to Benny Johnson because he'll give him a friendly interview. He'll ask him questions. He'll probably laud whatever it is that they're proposing. And it's a way that they can get their message out mostly unchallenged. And the example I'll give you is Marco Rubio, who I've known. I first started covering Marco Rubio in 2010 when he was a long shot primary candidate for the Republican Senate seat in Florida. I've known him for a long time, interviewed him dozens of times, spent a lot of time with him. And when he was one of the 3 finalists to be Donald Trump's running mate this summer, I was reporting out a piece about what kind of a vice president he'd be. Obviously, he was sort of a traditional Reaganite conservative for most of his career, Tea Party conservative, and he's gone through, I think, a rather dramatic transformation to become a MAGA spokesman. And I pitched Rubio's team, his Senate team and his campaign team, and said, hey, I'd like to sit down and interview him. I've interviewed him dozens of times. They all know me. And they said, we're very sorry. He doesn't have time to talk to you. And 2 days earlier, I had watched a video on Benny Johnson's website with Marco Rubio hanging out with Benny Johnson for 25 minutes and talking about all of these things, obviously, I think, to boost his chances of becoming Trump's running mate. And I wrote back to the Rubio team and said, all I'm asking is for the same amount of time you give Benny Johnson. And I didn't get it. I didn't get it. And look, I mean, I on a purely practical, sort of cold calculating level, I don't necessarily blame them. If you want to get your message out and you don't want to be challenged, that's the easiest way to do it. So I can understand from a logical perspective why they would approach it that way. I just think it's bad for the country. I would be fascinated to spend an hour with Marco Rubio and have him walk me through, somebody who's known him for a long time, understands what he believed. I mean, we shared beliefs for a long time. And actually ask him questions, not in a gotcha, beat him over the head kind of way, but like, hey, walk us through this. Tell me how you've gone from being a free trader to a proponent of sort of massive tariffs and some of the things that he's done. I think people would learn from that.
We're talking with Steve Hayes from the Dispatch. We've got to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington, D.C. You're listening to Sit Down with Russ Latino. Be back in just a moment.
Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
Mississippi is a place of deep roots where every story matters and every voice can be heard. At MPB, we stand with our local communities, bringing you the voices of those who shape our state through local programming that reflects our culture across small towns to big cities, from the Delta to the coast. We tell the stories that define us, from the music that carries our voices to the leaders who inspire change. MPB brings you the heart of Mississippi, celebrating Mississippi one story at a time. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bobby Rush. As a blues man, I love Mississippi Public Broadcasting. If you support Mississippi music and their local programming, donate now, right now, and become a member today, not tomorrow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Doesn't matter how big or small, but we prefer big. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Sit Down with Russ Latino right here on MPB Think Radio. We're talking today with Steve Hayes, the CEO of Dispatch. Fascinating conversation about kind of the state of the media, the state of mass communication. A lot of disruption happening right now, obviously, in that space. I'm curious, Steve, and I do want to shift to talk more about sort of the political side of things and what's going on with some substantive policy. But, you know, how much of this moment, which I've described sort of as a post-truth moment, do you blame on progressive sort of postmodern relativism being imposed in our education system? Because I do wonder at times, as a lot of progressives are lamenting where we are as a society, if some of what we're seeing isn't them reaping what was sowed when it comes to relativism.
Yeah, I think a lot of it. To be blunt, you know, when you have school districts or even individual teachers literally making arguments that 2 + 2 = 4 is sort of white imperial supremacy, to teach that to our kids, we're in trouble. And I don't want to make the case that that was widespread view, but you had examples of that in San Francisco and other places that too often, in my view, are sort of leading the way in setting the agenda for the rest of the country. So I definitely think that there's something to that. If you look at, for instance, the 1619 Project, which was New York Times writers' attempt to, I think, reframe what we know about American history. And you look at the full course of American history, and you look at some of the arguments that she made in that project, I would characterize as deeply misleading, some of them just false. They corrected some, they recast some of it, but you know, you had school districts that adopted that view of American history and taught it in the schools. And I think, you know, for people who have sent their kids to public schools, I've sent my kids to public school. I'm a product of public school. 1 kid in private school. I've got 3 kids in public school. And you look at some of the textbooks and you think, some of this is crazy. Some of this is crazy, what they're being taught. So I do think that there's that a lot of what we're seeing is a backlash to years, maybe even decades of frustration at what we've seen, and a sense that there wasn't anything we could do about it. And a lot of people turned to Donald Trump as the person who said, like, hey, I'm going to come in and fix this. They watched him on The Apprentice for years, even on The Celebrity Apprentice, telling people who didn't do what he said, you're gone, you're fired, you're out. And that had a lot of appeal when they'd been trying to make these changes through the old processes. I agree with some, maybe a lot of the diagnosis of the problems. I have my concerns both in this area and in many others about the solution and the way that we're going about a solution. But I think the diagnosis in many cases has been correct.
Yeah, you know, I just think to when I was in college, and I'm not that much younger than you are, we're both seasoned, I guess. But when I was in college, there were serious conversations that took place in classrooms about deconstructing the notion of objective truth, right?
Yes.
And so if you get to the point where the My Truth movement takes hold, then it's very easy to understand where we are right now, where it's like, well, if you're telling me there is no objective truth, that we can't know a final answer, well, then why isn't my truth just as good as your truth? And then it just becomes a power dynamic, right? It's like, who has the biggest microphone in the moment? They get to tell everybody else what is true, irrespective of what the empirical evidence is.
I think that's exactly right. And look, I mean, I want those conversations to be taking place in college classrooms. That's the place to have those discussions, right? You should explore the possibility of objective truth. You should wonder that. You should test the thesis. You should look at it 360 degrees. But then to sort of emerge from that and adopt it as the way of educating our kids from coast to coast and insisting, setting aside the fact that there's an irony in asserting that there is no objective truth,
right?
Because that in of itself would be an objective truth. So there's a logical and inherent contradiction in the argument that we're hearing. But I think, people just got tired of that kind of, college dorm philosophizing being what's driving the schools. And I would say the same is true with some of the excessive DEI programs and a lot of the race-based preference and quota programs were things that people looked around and, I think fair-minded people would say, hey, look, I'm all for recognizing historical injustices, and I'm even for doing what we can to offset those or to help people who have been hurt by those historical injustices. What I'm not in favor of is 200 points to somebody on the SAT because they're determined to be the quote unquote right race or ethnicity. And, it was for a long time, public polling suggested that people opposed racial quotas and preferences. But if you raised that, if you brought that up, you were somehow branded a racist. You weren't allowed to ask those questions. You weren't allowed to really have those debates. And I think that, people got just so frustrated with that. And I think we're seeing, again, something of a backlash to that.
Yeah, and of course the danger is that the backlash, instead of trying to get us back to center, that the pendulum swings too far the other direction, right? So that, a lot of the criticism from conservatives has been that the left is woke. There is a woke element on the right now.
Yes.
Right? That is very identity oriented in the way that they think about problems. That is equally troubling, or at least in my view, is equally troubling to what we described as the woke left.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. My colleague, Jonah Goldberg, wrote a piece about this. I think it was almost 2 years ago, and took a careful look at some of the rhetoric coming out of, what's often called the new right, the post-liberal right, and the identity-based arguments that were, prominent proponents of that thinking were making, and he described it as sort of the woke right. And I think it's every bit as problematic. If you want a true meritocracy, and I think that as difficult as that might be to achieve, I think that should be the goal. Well, that doesn't involve some of the things that we've seen. I mean, some of the things that we've seen from the Trump administration, I think, are chilling. I have great concerns with what Harvard has done over the years with its race-based admissions, with some of the excessive DEI efforts, certainly with the way it handled some of the protests and anti-Semitism on campus. But the answer, in my view, is not to come in and insist on, almost quotas for ideological diversity in the student body and in the faculty. I mean, I'd love for there to be more conservatives on Harvard's faculty. I think it'd be good for Harvard. I think it'd be good for the students. I think it'd be good for the country. But I don't want the federal government saying, send us a report telling us exactly how many self-identified conservatives you've had. I mean, that is Orwellian sort of doublespeak, in my view. So
let's shift a little bit, because I think this is in line to some degree. But if you think about, and now I'll date myself in a way that I think young people would say, do you know what time it is on X? But if you think about sort of the John Adams quip that we're supposed to be a nation of laws and not of men, or anybody who's ever read the Federalist Papers to get a sense of the battle that was going on at the time over what our Constitution, what our government would look like, you'd come away with a very clear impression that the founders were scared of government power, that they were trying to limit it and that they were trying to create, obviously, a system of checks and balances by separating it out. It strikes me that in the moment that we're in, we are a lot less Adams and Madison in our approach and a lot more Machiavelli. That we sort of have gotten to the point where we're no longer worried about institutions. We want strong people to tell us how to live. Am I overstating that?
Unfortunately, I don't think you are. And look, you don't have to look very far. I mean, you can see this. You can see this a lot. You can see this with, I think, some of the things that the Trump administration has done on free speech and on its attacks on the media. Some of that, I think you could say, this is an overdue correction. They don't need to give sort of favored status to establishment media outlets. It's appropriate for them to make room for new media outlets. I'm okay with all of that. That's fine. I think when you have the President of the United States singling out a network because he doesn't like a particular report on something, and threatening having his FCC chairman or others threatening repercussions because they don't like a particular report that says something bad about the president, that to me is scary. When you have them replacing the entire apparatus of our overseas broadcasting, which I think played a huge role in helping the United States win the Cold War, replacing them with a network like One America Network, which is mostly a Trump propaganda network. I have real problems with that. And then you have other examples of the administration both doing and saying things that are openly contrary to the rule of law, making arguments contrary to arguments made by Antonin Scalia, the revered conservative Supreme Court justice, that illegal immigrants here don't have a right to due process, holding U.S. citizens without due process. I think you're getting to the point where if you have a couple of these incidents, you can say, look, these are mistakes. They're quickly corrected. This isn't, this isn't indicative of a broader effort. When you have these stories on a daily basis, and when you have somebody like Stephen Miller, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, stand in the driveway of the White House and say, we're thinking about suspending habeas corpus, they're not particularly apologetic or cautious about telling us what they want to do. And I think the risks are exactly as you have described.
So I think what I struggle with in part with that, and I think a lot of people would respond to you and say, hey, look, the Biden White House tried to cancel student loans in contravention of the Supreme Court. On the way out the door, they said, hey, we're going to ratify essentially the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. Yeah. We're going to declare that there was a 28th Amendment ratified, right? And so I think a lot of people look at folks like you or me and say, you guys are living in this pristine, rules of Queensberry boxing type world where everything is supposed to work a certain way. And our ideological opponents aren't working that way. So we can't either.
You hear that a lot. I'm sure you hear it a lot. I guess, when you look, to go back to your point about the founders, that's not the system that we have. And I believe that the system devised by the framers of the Constitution is the most ingenious experiment in self-government ever known to man, ever on the face of the earth. And it's stood us in good stead for nearly 250 years. There's a reason it's worked the way that it's worked. I believe in the system. I think if you believe in the system, you have an obligation to do the things that strengthen the system and to play within the constraints that the framers gave us about the system. And that's true, I would say, not only even if your opponents, your political opponents, or people who don't agree with you on these things, people from a different political party aren't supportive of the system, but especially when they aren't supportive of the system. The answer is to double down on the system and to make the arguments that this is the best system known to man, and that there's a reason that governments around the world have emulated what the United States built and has had successfully for more than 2 centuries. The alternative, it seems to me, is a system that gets warped, where it is all about power. And you see a tug of war between maybe two different sides, sort of pushing and pulling, maximizing the exercise of power in a way that not only benefits their own side, but weakens or attempts to destroy the other side. And that is not a recipe for sustained political peace and effective governance, in my view.
So it strikes me that both political parties are struggling in different ways. Democrats don't have a clearly established messenger. They don't have a clearly established message. In a lot of ways, their fight is sort of like, hey, do we become centrist? Do we pick up disaffected Republicans and moderates who may have concerns about the Trump administration? Or do we lean in to the woke, right? And I think that fight's happening within the Democratic Party. At the same time, there's clearly a fight happening within the Republican Party. I've sort of summarized it as Reagan zombies versus the ghost of Pat Buchanan. It's probably more complex than that. As you look at what's happening in both parties, what's your read in terms of the opportunity? What's your read in terms of the weakness that both are experiencing?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Democrats. I mean, I think Democrats have only themselves to blame. They got caught. They played this identity politics game for decades. It's come back to bite them, and I think they are, as you said earlier, sort of reaping what they have sown in that context. I also think more immediately, it's hard to overstate the damage that Joe Biden did, I think, to the country and to the Democratic Party. This scandal about Biden's mental acuity, it should have been the leading story for the final 2 years of his presidency. You have now, and again, this book has many details about everybody who knew. I mean, it's hard to find a senior Democrat who didn't know and didn't make a comment and say that privately that they were worried about Joe Biden's ability to serve as president. And yet when they went out in public, they said the opposite again and again and again. Their credibility is in tatters, and it should be. It should be. Recovering from that, I think, is going to take a long time. And it doesn't surprise me that even with Donald Trump's favorability numbers in the high 30s and low 40s, that they're not able to take advantage of it, precisely because there are very few Democrats, prominent Democrats, who didn't get Joe Biden's back as he lied to the country about this. And it's no wonder to me that people didn't trust them. My suspicion is that leadership for the Democratic Party is most likely to come from the states, from outside of Washington in the next several years, because those in Washington saw Joe Biden up close, didn't do anything, and lied on his behalf. In the Republican Party, I agree with your framing of the sort of back and forth. It's very clear to me right now that the ghosts of Pat Buchanan, or if we want to say Donald Trump and Trumpism, MAGA, what have you, they own the Republican Party right now. Zombie Reagans, we call them zombie Reaganites for a reason. There aren't many of them willing to speak. I think that's different than saying there aren't many of them, even in elective office. The way that I've described it is, I think if you look at really both the House and the Senate, look at elected Republicans in the House and the Senate, you have roughly a third who are, we would describe as enthusiastic MAGA Republicans, pro-Trump, back Trump, no matter what he does, they're going to be with him. You have roughly a third who are Republican Party willing to be for Trump, willing to make arguments on behalf of Donald Trump, and wanting to reflect the views of their constituents who are strongly pro-Trump, but don't have sort of personal loyalty beyond sort of what benefits them politically. And then you have another third who I think are still what we might call zombie Reaganites. They're old school conservatives, movement conservatives, of the kind that I might have worked with when I worked at the Heritage Foundation and first coming to Washington, D.C. almost 30 years ago. And they're an interesting case because many of them will in private moments, in conversation with me, lament what's happened to the Republican Party, what's happened to the conservative movement, lament tremendous differences with the president on policy, whether it's tariffs, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's taxes and spending, whether it's the process, whether it's seeming not to care about the long history of governance that the framers laid out for us. But they're reluctant to say these things in public. And they usually will sort of tepidly endorse what President Trump is doing and get his back and vote on behalf of the policies that he's advancing. But they're grumbling about it privately. And I would say that's roughly a third as well. But for right now, it's very clear to me that the Trump side of this battle is prevailing. And if it succeeds, then he will have remade the Republican Party, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, I think
the zombie Reaganites go away.
Political scientists are going to be studying this period similarly to what they studied in the 1960s, is my hunch. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the question is there a moment where, for these zombie Reaganites, where they see their political interests more tied to independence from Donald Trump? I think on the tariff question, if he had gone down the road he was going down on tariffs, you would have started to see people really speak out in a way that we haven't seen people challenge President Trump on the Republican side. And, at a certain point, is there a critical mass? If we go into a recession, a deep recession, do Republicans think, hey, I'm better off having some distance from Donald Trump rather than supporting him?
So we've got to take a break, but when we come back, I want to make a devil's advocate argument in favor of what President Trump is doing right now and get your response. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. We're talking with Steve Hayes. We'll be back in just a moment.
The Measuring Show.
Since 1970, MPB has been enriching the lives of Mississippians.
Everything we do gives us the chance to grow and learn.
With your support, we are always there whenever and wherever you need us. Together through the years, together in the future. Please consider making a donation at mpbfoundation.org. MPB, your stories, our mission.
When the weather turns severe, when breaking news affects your family, when Mississippi needs answers, MPB is there. We provide real-time emergency alerts, trusted news coverage, and live broadcasts of emergency updates. Available on TV, radio, and online. MPB is on the air and by your side every day of the year. Because when it matters most, Mississippi turns to MPB, Mississippi's trusted source. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Talking today with the CEO of the Dispatch, NBC News contributor Steve Hayes. Steve, I said before we went to break that I'd present you with a devil's advocate argument about why President Trump is actually doing a good job and get you to respond. So here we go. The president made his intentions on trade pretty clear and has for 40 years. Made his intentions around the border clear, made his intentions around foreign policy clear during the campaign. For the first time in a very long time, Republicans won the popular vote, won all 7 swing states, won more African Americans than we typically do, right? Won more Hispanic voters than the Republican Party typically does. Congress has abdicated its role for a considerable period of time. They have ceased to serve their natural function in creating policy, and in the place of it, the president is trying to get things done. The border's secure, inflation is down, and the sky didn't fall with tariffs the way that some people predict it. Are the Chicken Littles and the critics wrong?
Yeah, it's a good case. I think you made among the better cases that I've heard on behalf of Donald Trump. And I agree with some of those points. I think for the most part, he did campaign on this. He is doing, to some extent, what he was elected to do. There's a reason that you had more than 70 million Americans vote for him. I would argue that a lot of those reasons were that he wasn't Joe Biden, and that Kamala Harris sat alongside Joe Biden and vouched for him as he lied to the American public about his ability to do the job. But certainly some of this is what Donald Trump promised to do, and he's delivering. I would say this is particularly true on the border, where I think presidential rhetoric can make a huge difference. And we saw in the early stages of the Biden administration, at first, an unwillingness to even recognize that there was a problem. I remember listening to White House people speaking from the White House podium, denying that there was even a problem, that there was even a crisis. Why are you calling this a crisis? We could see with our own eyes that it was a problem, that it was a crisis, and that we needed to tighten up the border. Donald Trump said he was going to do it. He came in and he did it. I have real problems, as we discussed earlier, with some of the ways in which he's doing that. I don't think you can take extrajudicial steps in order to accomplish these goals. And I worry that those extrajudicial steps will embolden him to take extrajudicial steps in other areas that I think we should all be very concerned about. But in terms of getting that job done, I think there's little question. I think that it was way too early to talk about what the outcome will be of his tariff policy. In fact, it's too early to really understand his tariff policy. It sometimes changes from morning to afternoon. And if you've spent any time talking to small business owners, as I have, they don't know what to do. And reducing tariffs on China from 145% to 30% doesn't solve their problems. They don't know where to make investments. They don't know how much they're going to be charged in tariffs if they're importing component parts from China or Vietnam or Europe. You can't run a business that way. It's going to drive people out of business. It already has, I think, in some cases, had those effects. I talked to some wine importers specialized in importing European wine. Maybe on the surface, the least sympathetic people in America, right? Yeah, people can go without their fancy European wine. But most of these are small businesses, and they were small businesses set up as a result of requirements in laws and regulations in a post-prohibition period. You have to have American companies doing the importing and the distributing. So our government rules incentivized them, created this industry, and now we're punishing them with really high tariffs that they can't, in many cases, pay. It will drive some of them out of business, I'm certain. And I also think that we will ultimately see the inflationary effects of tariffs that I had mentioned before. And people will be scrambling, I think, relatively soon when we don't have goods from China. The Trump administration has very much changed its argument on that. It was a couple weeks ago. It was little kids don't need more than $2. Now this is the greatest thing because people will be able to buy more, and we've reduced tariffs. Their revolving justification on tariffs, I think, is a problem. On national security and foreign policy, I think the jury's out on that. It makes me, I will say, deeply uncomfortable. President Trump gave a big speech in the Gulf yesterday, sort of laying out a new U.S. approach to foreign policy. I can understand people who look back at the Bush era and say, "Oh, you were wild-eyed optimists. You thought that American values could translate and improve countries that are inhospitable to those kinds of values. We need to be more realistic, or we need to be more hard-headed about the way that we approach countries in the region and dictators and tough guys." That's very different than praising and admiring those dictators. The things that the praise that President Trump had for the new leader of Syria, called him strong, said he's got a history of being really strong. Yeah, you know why he was strong? He was a leader of an Al-Qaeda splinter group. I don't want the U.S. president praising somebody like that. The things he was saying about Mohammed bin Salman, one of the leaders of Saudi Arabia, I don't want the United States saying those things. I think it's important to articulate our values. So I think the jury is out on some of this. He's had some early success. I think DOGE was a lot of hype that's not delivering on the hype. That they don't talk about it much anymore. There's a reason they don't talk about it much anymore, because it didn't eliminate $2 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse. It was a fraction of that, if anything, and it might end up costing us.
Yeah, so we're in this interesting moment where in the first 100 days, Congress only passed 5 bills, which I think is the lowest on record, or at least modern record. But there's this one big, beautiful bill, and we've only got a couple minutes left in the program. I'm curious if you would share your thoughts on what's in the one big, beautiful bill. Is it going to be good? Do you see it passing?
Yeah, I mean, we're still learning everything that's in one big, beautiful bill, which is the problem with doing this in one big, beautiful bill, right? I mean, I think the solution is to get back to regular order and serious budgeting so that our members of Congress play a role in determining what's in these bills, and the American public can see and make evaluations based on this. Look, there are entitlement programs like Medicaid, which is sort of at the center of this controversy. There's great room to improve those, to make them more efficient, to introduce work requirements for able-bodied adults who can work rather than just making payments on their behalf. I think right now that's a hard argument for Republicans to make, in part because some of these other policies, I would say, including tariffs, are creating economic conditions that I think are likely to hurt some of the people that those reforms are designed to change incentives for. So I think that's a real problem. The part of the problem in passing this bill is that there have been difficult communications from President Trump himself. He seemed to be aligned with the Senate in wanting to break this up into 2 bills initially. Then he signed on with the House, who wanted to do this in one big, beautiful bill. That's the way they're approaching it now. I think Senate leaders are not necessarily bought in. So it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge for them to pass it.
Steve, this has been a great conversation. I feel like we could probably have done this for 3 or 4 hours, because everything you said, I had 6 or 7 more questions pop to mind. But we appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming on with us.
Well, I sure enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Great. The Sit Down is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting, Think Radio, funded by generous contributions from listeners like you. Today's show was produced by St. Germain Flood in the booth. How are you, St. Germain?
Oh, I'm good, Russ. Good. It was a good show.
With live stream by Abram Nanny. For my guest, Steve Hayes, I'm Russ Latino. Stay tuned for Southern Remedy at 11 a.m. and join us next week for another episode of The Sit Down, only on MPB Think Radio.